The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
The Endurance Experience is back with Season 5. For those veteran listeners, welcome, and for those newly joining, welcome. As described in the intro, the Endurance Experience is the intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Walk with us as we examine the science of self-propelled motion with evidence-based discussions. That is the distinguishing factor of this podcast. I want the audience to know that they can come here for the facts and truth, backed by nothing but empirical evidence insofar as we can discern it. And we move away from the preordained positions and reverse engineered beliefs, just the distilled science. And that is monumentally important. So there's much information out there in the public sphere, and far too much of it, unfortunately, I have to say, is bad information. And sometimes it's not deliberate, it's just incomplete information or done with genuinely good intention. So we will pick through that as much as we can to get to the complete answer if we can, and then call balls and strikes wherever they land, based on only what the best science available says. So asking me what position do I have on a certain topic is like asking an umpire, do you call balls or do you call strikes? This leads me to the subject of this podcast, titled The Race Weight Question. When considering this as a podcast topic, a Runner's World article ran past one of my social media feeds. So articles by these big magazines like Runner's World will often contract with people to write articles. They don't necessarily work for the magazine itself. And the magazines will reach out to contractors, hey, would you write an article about some topic? And from time to time, I actually get the same requests, and I've written some articles out there for some magazines. But this one particular Runner's World article was called The Dangerous Lie of the Perfect Running Weight. And you can go Google it and do some reading. It's a well-written article. It's filled with examples of dieting gone wrong, or athletes that would undergo extreme caloric restriction in an effort to try to get faster, but receive disastrous results. Turns out, after doing a little Google examination, the author is self-described as an anti-diet HAES registered dietitian. And if you don't know what HAES is, that means health at every size. I had a couple of podcasts that had two PhDs, clinical obesity PhDs, who talked about that and had challenges with the HAES approach. You can go to my podcast number 4 with Dr. Stephan Guyenet, and also my episode 26, the Nutrition Podcast with Dr. Michelle Cardell. She's a PhD, an obesity researcher, and also a registered dietitian. Those podcasts just give a general overview and discussion about nutrition generally, but also they opine on what they think about the HAES approach. So back to the article. It is well written and gives good examples of how extreme approaches with athletes go very wrong sometimes. I wasn't left convinced the article was appropriately scientifically balanced. Now, it was Warren Buffett's closest partner, Charlie Munger, who once stated, "If you disagree with somebody, you want to be able to state their case better than they can." To that end, know that I've spoken up mightily about this topic of the way endurance athletes can often abuse nutrition practices and get involved in extreme nutrition practices that lead to eating disorders and disordered eating. I'd like to point you to my podcast number 15 with Dr. Margot Mountjoy, who's both an MD and a PhD, who works for the International Olympic Committee. That was a great podcast. And she doesn't do many podcasts. She was very nice to me, and we did an entire podcast on the now defunct Nike Oregon Project, which was a running think tank out in Oregon that was at least alleged to put women through very extreme nutrition protocols. And we did an entire podcast on what was previously called the female athlete triad and what's now called Red S, relative energy deficiency in sport, because we now know that both men and women can fall prey to these negative effects. And so we talked about eating disorders and disordered eating and prevention, etc. So I'd offer that podcast to you for anyone who feels that may be affected or for education, but also as my proof that I can steel man these arguments with the best of them. Anything can be abused in sport. Athletes can take performance-enhancing drugs or take unreliable, unregulated supplements, for instance. So nutrition practices are just another example of how something can be applied unscientifically or incorrectly. But for this podcast, number 42, I wanted to demonstrate to athletes of all levels and coaches the other side of the coin and have a discussion about the scientific basis behind the connection between body composition and self-propelled motion, or what some athletes colloquially called racing weight. We can have a science and evidence-based conversation about strategies to appropriately consider this inside of the training cycle. And insofar as athletes, recreational to professional, might wish to achieve their goals, to meet or exceed the demands of endurance events with proper education and guidance, they can do so. To help me in this endeavor, I've enlisted a guest who should be no stranger to this audience. He is Matt Fitzgerald. He is an endurance sports coach, nutritionist, and the author of 31 books, including his most recent book, just released this month, Run Like a Pro, Even If You're Slow. He's the co-founder of 80/20 Endurance, and in addition to his 31 books, his writing also appears regularly in magazines and on websites such as Women's Running and OutsideOnline.com. He has online training plans that have helped thousands of athletes. And the book that he wrote that was impactful to me was his book, Racing Weight, the 6-step plan for endurance athletes, how to get lean for peak performance. and I've had both editions, the first edition, and I've had now have the second edition to that book. And that is the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with Matt, because his book Racing Weight took me into new direction, both as an athlete and also a coach, and it also framed the way I scientifically approach the education of athletes about body composition inside of the training cycle. So we talk about his motivation behind writing the book Racing Weight. We talk about the scientific basis behind the impact of body composition to an athlete that is moving. We talk about the concept of the quote-unquote optimal performance weight or optimal performance range, and how athletes can evaluate that within their training cycle. And we talk quite a bit about nutrition, and we do a little bit of nutrition, daily nutrition, as well as fueling appropriately. And finally, I wanted to get Matt's thought on, if he were to write the book today, how would his views change in the over decade since he wrote the original edition? Additionally, how has his approach changed with his athletes given all of the heightened awareness around this topic? Okay, I've talked enough. I just wanted to appropriately set the stage for this podcast. So, without further delay, I give you Matt Fitzgerald. I am on with Matt Fitzgerald. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
My pleasure, Tony.
I think many in our audience, the endurance experience, know you well. You're an author, you're a coach, you're a nutritionist, and you're a speaker. And you've authored quite a number of books. How many total books have you authored?
I had one that just came out last week, so I think we're at 31 now.
Wow,
31
wow.
books.
Yeah, so many, and every time I think about an idea for a book, I immediately drop it because I know you've already written it. I know. I say to myself, Matt has already written the book, and I don't think I could do any better than that. So the newest one is Run Like a Pro. Yes.
Yeah.
Is that out?
Pro. Yeah. Even if you're slow. Yep. It came out that's the one that dropped last Tuesday, the 1st of March. Yep. Excellent.
I'll put the link in the show notes so that the listeners can pick it up. And so publicly, I see also that you were very public about you had a bout with COVID, a long COVID. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm still long hauling, as they say. So yeah, I'm about 17, just past 17 months of, since the initial onset of the chronic symptoms. I was sick with the acute virus for about a month, and then was actually healthy and seemed to be, fully recovered for about 6 months. And then I started to go backwards, which seems strange to me, but I've heard, just in kind of researching the topic since then, that it's not that uncommon actually to have a little bit of reprieve between the acute virus and the long haul stuff. So yeah, I'm still, I still don't exercise. I still can't. It's still toxic for me to run or bicycle or swim or any of that stuff. So it's a waiting game.
Yeah, and that is an example that I think everyone can look at, because someone with your level of fitness to be sidelined, that it just underscores why everyone needs to take it seriously with the preventive measures. So I hope everything goes well and you're back out there and you can run soon again.
Appreciate that.
Okay. So the topic of this podcast is the race weight question. And, much of the focus and heightened awareness around this topic today, there's a lot of well-written articles about inclusivity, about the dangers of how this can be weaponized or even abused in sport. But my aim with this podcast was to show that you can, in fact, have a science and evidence-based conversation that's factual and helpful to athletes of all abilities, from recreational to professional, and show people that you can actually look at this racing weight question and really identify some specifics that could help you as an endurance athlete. And then, so one of your books, Racing Weight, and I have the second edition. I've had that on my shelf for years. And this book really took me into new direction. And I think it's highly scientific. There's a lot of research in here. And obviously, from your coaching experience and nutrition experience, you have put together a great resource that could be helpful to the endurance athlete. So I highly recommend picking it up. I'll also put the link in the show notes. So let's start by just, if I could ask you, what drove you to write this book? And in the book, you highlight 6 high-level steps that you outline in the book that should be the focus of athletes, recreational to professional. And I'm wondering if you might be able to also comment on those.
Sure thing. I'll tackle the first half of that question. I might need your help with the second, because I don't have a copy in front of me. And I first started working on the first edition of Racing Weight, I want to say in 2009. And it was a very different environment at that time. Like the South Beach diet, I think, was huge. It was still like, it seems like the era of like the mega best-selling diet craze book is like you had Atkins before that, and then you had South Beach, and then you had paleo, and then keto, and just like one after another, like big weight loss crazes. And so that was the environment back in 2009, but that wasn't really my concern. I was an endurance athlete, an endurance coach, a sports nutritionist. And, what I saw at that time was, it's simply, an obvious fact that if you're pursuing performance as an endurance athlete, optimizing, your body composition and body weight is one piece of that puzzle. It's only one among many pieces. There are literally dozens. But it to deny the fact that body weight and body composition impact endurance performance is foolish. And I was aware of this. The athletes I coached and trained with were aware of this. So there was a lot of conversation about. It was interesting, I half jokingly referred to Racing Weight as the diet book for skinny people, because we had, we weren't folks who just wanted to look good in the mirror naked. Like we wanted to PR and qualify for Boston and qualify for Kona. And what I saw was that athletes who were who were looking to optimize their performance through improvements in body composition and body weight were actually like choosing the popular fad diets. Right. Triathletes were going on the South Beach diet, which was not written by or for endurance athletes, for the sake of improving their endurance performance. And my thought was, that's no good.
Right.
There are good and bad ways to go about this. And so I wanted to, you said you come up with ideas for books and don't write them because I've written them already. Well, I'm not that different. My thought was like, there needs to be like a credible, authoritative, empirical resource that shows athletes, the right way to go about optimizing their body composition and body weight for endurance performance. I looked around, that resource didn't exist, so I wrote it.
Right. Yeah. And just to, get in front of, and you would agree with me before we even get into the conversation, everyone of all body types can go out and enjoy the sport of endurance. It doesn't matter how you look. You can go out and run. You can be a runner. And that's different. I think what's happening is there's sort of an overcorrection to this now because of recent incidences where people have weaponized this and used it wrongly. Like you said, it's one of many factors that a coach can employ. And would you agree, just to get in front of that, recreational athletes can also, regardless of what, their body size is, can be good athletes and enjoy the sport. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, few things, bring me more joy than seeing someone who, doesn't look like an endurance athlete in the traditional, Hollywood, central casting, like vision of like, what a triathlete's supposed to look like. I love seeing folks of different shapes and sizes come into the sport. It's a big tent. For me, the more, the merrier. And it's not all about qualifying for Boston or for Kona for every athlete. So for you, there are just so many benefits of taking up, adopting this lifestyle. And, and again, for me, it's really, it never was or never will be about how you look.
Right.
It's just about this, this sort of inner transformation you can experience by embarking on this journey.
Yeah. You outlined the 6 steps. The first 3 being improve diet quality, manage appetite, and then balancing energy sources. How would you expand on those 3?
Yeah, number 1 is if you're looking to take full advantage of the power that nutrition has to help you get fitter and perform better as an athlete, if you're only going to make one change to your current habits, it should be to improve the quality of your diet.
Right.
And especially when I first wrote this book, this concept of diet quality it didn't have much cultural currency at all. It was all about, carbs, fat, protein, like, calories and macronutrients. So it was like the entire conversation. And when the average person thinks about, quality in relation to diet, they think of like, oh yeah, a good cut of steak or like an organic vegetable. But for nutrition scientists, quality actually is just related to outcomes. Like a food type or a diet is considered to be high in quality if it is associated at a population level with positive outcomes for health and fitness. So, if eating more vegetables reduces cancer risk, that is evidence that vegetables are a high quality food type. Yeah. There are various indices that have been developed to, like the Mediterranean Diet Index, and even like your food pyramid is based on nutrition science concepts of diet quality. It's just like, certain combinations. And really what it comes down to is like, if you want to maximize the quality of your diet, you should eat a wide variety of food types, and the foods within those types that you do eat should be unprocessed for the most part. So variety and lack of processing, like you put those two things together and you end up with what any nutrition scientist would call a high quality diet. And whether you're a non-athlete looking just to be healthier and live longer and feel better, or you're an athlete looking to get leaner and go faster, taking those steps to improve your diet quality will get you where you want to go.
Right. So fruits, vegetables, lean meats, seafood, insofar as you eat meat and seafood, nuts, seeds, things like that.
Yep.
Right. And managing appetite. So in your book, you say most athletes, they eat more than is required to meet their needs and satisfy their hunger. Our modern food environment is set up to all but ensure that we overeat without even realizing it.
Yeah. Yes. It's interesting because, if I wrote that today, I would add a little bit more nuance to it because, in the general population, in wealthy societies, like, you and I are in the United States, overeating is, sort of an epidemic,
right.
Overweight, obesity, chronic diseases associated with overeating are a huge problem.
Correct.
And so, that is the environment we all grow up in. It's referred to as obesogenic, just like there are all these forces, social forces conspiring to fatten us up.
Right.
But within that culture, there is a little bit of a counterculture of endurance athletes where actually, undereating is relatively pervasive. So in the population at large, correct, overeating is the problem.
Right.
But within the subpopulation of especially serious endurance athletes, undereating is also a problem. So
that's a problem as well. Yeah.
Yes. So you can miss the mark on both sides. And so I think, the starting point for most athletes is overeating or these forces, just pushing in the direction of eating too much. Mm-hmm. And that comes from, things ranging from highly processed foods, which are sort of like concocted to make us want to eat more of them, right? To pervasive food marketing, just like we have all these messages, like, 3 for $1, whatever, Taco Bell's 4th meal campaign, like get up in the middle of the night and eat again. So we can kind of get it from both sides. So
right.
It's a little tough.
Eating disorders, disordered eating. This is also a side of it that can be pervasive. And we saw instances with the now defunct Nike Oregon project, which made news a couple of years ago. So there's examples where this can be weaponized or abused on both ends. And so it's important. This book and some of the stuff in it is very important for the GPS for the endurance athlete and how you can actually use proven techniques to optimize your performance if that's your goal. So you also talk about balancing your energy sources, and from here you mean carbohydrates, fat, protein, and trying to do that in an efficient way.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's, that would be number one in most diet books, or, at least in circa 2009, when I wrote the first edition of Racing Weight. It's just, it was all, as I alluded to before, it was all about carbs, fat, and protein. Carbs being like, fat was the old villain, and then carbs moved in to be the new villain.
Right.
But, again, if we're just going to be, science-based, and actually, not just science-based, but also looking at real world best practices, it's like, why not eat the way the people who win races eat?
Right.
And if you take, if you look through that lens as well, what you see is that, carbs, especially if they're coming from, unprocessed foods, are not a villain. They're rocket fuel for endurance performance. And so, the way I look at it is that, the place of carbohydrate in your diet should be proportional to the volume of your training. So if you're a very casual athlete and maybe only exercise 30 minutes a day, 3 times per week, you don't need a lot of carbs. And in fact, eating, having, too much carbohydrate in your diet could probably, have negative consequences on your body composition if you have, a low activity level. But as your training load increases, and you're expending more energy through activity, you need, not just more carbohydrate in absolute terms, but more carbohydrate as a, relative proportion of your diet. So, if a 45% carbohydrate diet is, perfectly adequate, again, assuming high quality sources, is perfectly adequate for, for someone who is very casual and exercises for short periods of time for a few times per week. If you're just, the hardcore Ironman triathlete, like I was in my day, exercising 20 hours per week, sometimes more, then, again, assuming high quality from your sources, even like a 70% carbohydrate diet could have you feeling great, demolishing your workouts, recovering well,
right,
and achieving your goals in races.
Right. Okay. And steps 4, 5, 6, monitor yourself, timing, nutrition, and then training. So monitoring yourself, are there any recommended tools now in 2022 that are on the top of your list, whether it be wearable technology or any other types of technologies? What do you recommend for your athletes with monitoring?
Yeah, that's another one where, again, if I wrote that book today, I would, again, it's not like I would take it all back, but I would add a little bit more nuance. And I encourage athletes to be very process focused,
right?
Where it's like, the mistake that a lot of athletes make is to assume an endpoint. It's like, here's where I need to get, like, I need to weigh this, or my body fat percentage needs to be that. Well, sure. How do you know? Like, honestly, like you don't know.
Right.
And so if the goal is to just, get fitter and perform better, we know the means to that end, but you can't really anticipate the end point. So, my emphasis is do things by the book, train by the book, eat by the book, and see where you get. Now, the role of monitoring in that process is not to like set an arbitrary goal ahead of time and, measure your progress toward that goal, but just to know where you are.
Just to know where you are, right?
Especially if you're, like for me, I started running when I was 11 and, I was 49 when I was derailed by long COVID. So that's a long time. So I knew the body weight and body composition at which I tended to perform my best. So, there's a cyclicality to it. Like, during the holidays, the off season, I was training less. I was indulging in a little bit more dessert. I would gain a little weight. Absolutely no problem. There's a time and a place for that. But, when the calendar flipped and I was looking at my next important, start line, I knew where I needed to get back to. And so monitoring plays a role there where you're just like, okay, like how am I doing so far? And it can just simply keep you honest. If you're just slacking a little bit in some of like eating a little bit more cheese than you really need to eat, and your weight on the scale or your body fat measurements indicate that like you're not moving quickly enough in the right direction, then maybe you cut back on the cheese. But yeah, to get back to your original question, is there anything new that's come along? Not so much, because we're really talking about, body weight and body composition, first and foremost.
Right. And Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of technology now, wearable tech apps that do tracking and things like that, and they all have varying degrees of impact and usefulness. So I think it's just like you said, in the end, knowing where you are with respect to timing and timing your nutrition, the step 5. How do you recommend employing that? Do you mean, for instance, someone has a big training weekend, a big training block coming up, and perhaps they take a tactical approach to fueling on, say, Friday or Thursday coming up, leading up to that big training block? How do you recommend timing?
Yeah, the basic point is that when you eat matters almost as much as what you eat,
right?
And then then you get down to the details and specifics from there. In terms of in tactical terms, yeah. Calorie intake should be concentrated around periods of heightened calorie expenditure, right? So that for athletes, the most intensive periods of caloric expenditure are workouts and races. So, fueling up before, fueling during as appropriate, and fueling up after for the recovery period. Not only will you tend to perform better in your workouts and thereby get more out of them, and also recover better afterwards by doing that, but that also facilitates your movement toward optimizing your body composition, because it's referred to as nutrient partitioning. Like your body will channel, once the calories have gone down your throat and into your tummy, they can go different places and for different uses, depending on the context. So if the same athlete with the same training could eat the same number of calories at different times and end up with two very different body compositions. Yep. If one is eating when they don't need to and not eating when they should, and the other is eating when they should and not eating when they don't need to. So concentrating. Within the day, concentrating calorie intake around workouts, and then also, first thing in the morning or early in the morning, generally, because you've gone through the overnight fast and you're in a little bit of a mild deprivation state at those times as well. I'm pretty sure I cite it in the book. There's interesting research within day calorie deficits. So, as I mentioned before, like not eating enough is probably more problematic, has more consequences for an athlete than eating too much. But even if you eat enough within a day, if you fall behind in your needs over the course of the day, so you have like deficits that you eventually make up for by the time you go to bed, that will have negative consequences for your performance, recovery, and body composition.
Right. Okay. And training right is the step 6 that you cite. So let's tackle, in your first chapter, you have Get Leaner, Go Faster. And I wonder if you could explain this to the listeners, the scientific basis behind this, why this is true for the endurance athlete. If someone came up to you and said, what's the scientific underpinning behind leaner bodies moving more efficiently in an endurance event? How would you answer the question?
Yeah, it's so it's a little bit physics and a little bit physiology. Running is a good example, because in running you're moving against gravity. Like running is really just controlled jumping.
Right.
And so if you know your physics, you know that the more mass your body contains, the more you weigh, the more energy it takes to take a hop forward, from one foot to the next, as you do, repeatedly in running. If you run a marathon, that's 55,000 steps, each and every one of them against gravity. So, the more mass on your body, the more energy it takes, and you only have so much energy. So, you'll cover that distance a lot more quickly if you have less mass, to carry over that distance. So that's the physics part of it. The physiology part of it is that body fat is dead weight. Most other tissues of your body actually contribute to forward motion, muscles being the obvious example. Like, muscles weigh something. So there's a cost. You have to move your muscles just as much as you have to move any other tissue in your body. But right. Your muscles are actually doing the work of moving you. It's like the engine of a car. So, and so you don't want to get rid of your muscle. But body fat makes no, beyond the minimal amount that's required just to be healthy. And body fat is active tissue. It's not completely dead weight, but it's not the same as muscle where right. it moves you forward. It's a reserve energy source. So you need a certain amount of, like, body fat is not bad. You need a certain amount to be healthy and to train and to get from point A to point B. But beyond that, any excess beyond that, just it doesn't contribute to forward motion, and it adds to the cost of getting from point A to point B. So right. For those reasons, in like a sport like swimming, there's no particular cost to being heavier. But still, elite swimmers tend to have a relatively low body fat percentage, because, the physics factor is a little different there, but the physiology factor is not. So those are the two basic reasons you want to be lean and light.
Right, and of course, VO2 max is a key indicator of endurance performance, which is the volume of the oxygen your muscles are using in milliliters per minute per kilogram of body weight. So body weight is the denominator in that. And so, that's a key measure of performance. Also in cycling, we use
power to weight
ratio, right? So watts per kilogram of body weight. And so all these measures, which are endurance sport measures, use body weight as the denominator. So that tells you a lot there about the explanatory power of these power to weight ratios. So you also mentioned muscle, right? So there's also a tip, you talk about it in the book, a tipping point where you could tip the scales to too much muscle, right? So if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson woke up right. tomorrow and decided he wanted to be the fastest marathoner in the world, that he would have to get together with his coaches and his trainers to figure out a long-term plan to right. adapt. Right. So talk about that. All right. So some people have that issue.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah. It's really a matter of form follows function, right? Mm-hmm. So, if you want to be the fastest marathoner in the world, and this actually gets to, step 6, the one we sort of glanced over, mm-hmm. Train right. If you want to become the best marathoner you can be, well, you're going to train like a marathon, right? You're going to follow best practices. And if you do that, if you train right and you're doing everything we talked about on the nutrition side, your body is going to evolve. And if your starting point is the body of Dwayne Johnson, then, Dwayne Johnson's never going to end up looking like Eliud Kipchoge, but he will move in that direction. And it's not a matter of wanting to look more like Eliud Kipchoge. It's a matter of form follows function. Just right. Training a bit like Kipchoge and eating like him. And, so your body's smart. It's really smart. Like, it knows when you're asking it to be good at running long distances, because you're trying to do that and you're fueling to do that. So, again, if you do those things, that evolution, it's like growing a beard. You don't will it, you let it happen. You stop shaving. Right. You trust in the intelligence of your body. And
and try to sort of allow your body to solve for the optimal scenario for you.
Exactly.
And, yeah. So, and it's all covered, oxygen delivery, your cardiovascular system is delivering oxygen to less cells, things like that. Biomechanics, right? So if you ever see these marathon runners, my goodness, their biomechanics are incredible. They're so lean. The range of motion,
right?
And the range of motion is just completely different from
yes
the average person because of the leanness in the legs and such. So there's a lot of effects there, and so you go into that in your get leaner, get faster, and the justification behind the scientific justification behind why this is true. So now let's talk about the next step. If in your chapter 3 you have the sort of optimal performance weight. If someone is trying to figure out, and again, preface if we were to preface this and say that you can overcorrect here and get too consumed with some number,
right?
How would you recommend that someone try to determine if they were a performance athlete, whether they're trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon, whether they're trying to hit a big PR or trying to qualify for Kona or the World Championships, how would they go about trying to derive this optimal performance range, weight or range for them? And how would they marry the combination of data and trying to get your body to solve for it itself?
Right. Yeah. The two keys are, again, to sound like a broken record, are trust the process. Like do the things that work, because that's why in the online the Racing Weight website, where I created sort of a calculator based on the information in that chapter you just referred to. I refer to it as an estimator, not a calculator.
Right.
It's just a way of sort of narrowing down, the possibilities for where you might reasonably end up. So number one is trust the process, and number two is monitor, because again, the idea, you're not trying to win a body fat contest. You're trying to get faster. You're trying to, qualify for Boston or Kona or PR at a certain distance. So, you need to make sure that, measure what matters, like, are you actually getting fitter objectively, empirically? Are you performing better? So, that's the way to sort of triangulate and determine, what direction you're heading in and where you're likely to end up. In the book, I do provide, some basic guidelines, and they're based on your, in terms of if you're an athlete who's sort of at the beginning of your journey and you just, it's obvious you're not at your optimal performance weight, and you're just trying to get a sense of what's realistic for me. The factors to consider are: 1, your age; 2, your sex, male or female; 3, your where you are now. If you're obese, then how far you can get is probably different than for someone who's not at that starting point. And then also your history, your life history. So there's your sort of recent history where you are now, but also your extended history with body weight. So when I came up with that estimator, and then it's just I had a resource with reference data for a huge population of people, men and women of all ages, who had subjected to hydrostatic weighing, which at the time was the gold standard for body composition tests. So
the Kip Russo tables.
Right. Exactly. So it's just a matter of like sort of narrowing it down and seeing like, given like these things about you, here's like, a range in which you could realistically end up if you focus on the process, doing things right.
Yep. And then you estimate based upon a reasonable body composition that you can improve, and then you can sort of get an idea of what that range might be. And that's very helpful because sometimes there are genetic components that someone might have the typical, what they call the somotype, right? Ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph. And I was always that mesomorph, right? So I was always the person that held, I could walk by a weight and just get hypertrophy. Right? I was always genetically just had larger muscle mass, especially larger muscle mass in the lower body. And I always knew that was a quote unquote problem. Some people would say it's a good problem to have, but it's a headwind if you want to get to the highest levels of highest percentiles of endurance performance. And so sometimes you just have to figure out what do you have and how can you do the best with what you have. And sometimes, these tables and data where you can marry the data with your genetics can help you just have a GPS and point you in the right direction.
Yes. Yeah. That's well said. In showing you what's realistic, it's also showing you what's not realistic. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, like Dwayne Johnson could look at that and say, I'm not going to end up with Eliud Kipchoge's body weight and body composition. Right. And that's okay.
Right. And that's the thing. Some people are just genetically like I always knew that I genetically had higher muscle mass. Now, someone can be 10% body fat, but still carry a lot of muscle on them, in which case that person has to now make a decision. All right. Am I in this for recreational enjoyment? In which case, then I'm going to do the best I can with the attributes that I have, or as whether or not, in the Dwayne Johnson use case, hypothetical, is that person serious? Well, that person's going to have to have a serious long-term outlook on how they need to change their body composition to achieve that goal to be the world's best marathoner. So these are the things that you have to sit down and really weigh, ideally with, professionals. Let's switch to, you talked a little bit about this, about the diets, and as a coach, every now and then I have to field the questions about everybody's got a new fad diet, whether it's keto, whether it's intermittent fasting, whether it's, and to me, all of these diets, you can tell me your opinion. These are often just different ways of getting to caloric deficits. They don't really do, a lot of times they don't do what they propose they do. They're just different ways of getting to caloric deficits. And as coaches, it's a challenge to navigate the minefield of the social media nutritionists out there that are employing all of these strategies. So you talk about in the book the difference between dieting and performance weight management for athletes, right? Someone looking to meet or exceed the demands of races or endurance events. So what is the difference between, in your opinion, dieting and performance weight management? How would you explain the difference to an athlete?
They are fundamentally different goals. With dieting, you are typically losing weight for the sake of losing weight. With performance weight management, you are aiming to optimize your body weight and composition for endurance performance. So with those different goals, come different optimal methodologies.
Right.
The quickest way to lose weight is to stop eating, or to drastically reduce your eating. That's a scientifically proven fact. When for folks who are morbidly obese, where it's actually to the point where it's like a health emergency.
Mm-hmm.
That's what is done with those folks to keep them alive. They're put on VLCDs, very low calorie diets.
Right.
Basically, a version of fasting. Now, so obviously for an endurance athlete, someone who's, working out, pretty much every day, often intensively, that's not going to work. Right. So, that's a great way to lose weight very quickly, but it's going to completely sabotage your goals as an endurance athlete. So they're just, right. they're different orientations towards, changing your weight and body composition. And with those different goal orientations come completely different optimal methodologies. And I should say that you could be an endurance athlete and toggle between the two depending on where you are. So I tell athletes all the time, and it's part of the reason I wrote a follow-up to the Racing Weight book, is like, if even as an endurance athlete, there might be a time when losing weight is your primary objective ahead of fitness and performance. And if the example I give is often is like, Tour de France cyclists, like they'll often when they're coming off their off season, their annual break from racing, and they've partied a little bit and enjoyed, their break, they've gained a little weight. And before they pivot back into full training, they'll often reduce their calorie intake, reduce their carbohydrate intake, lift weights more, reduce their aerobic exercise level, because those are all great ways to lean up quickly. They're not great ways to win the Tour de France.
Right.
But, so even for an athlete who wants to win the Tour in July, in early February, it might be a great time to eat a lot of protein and not a lot of carbohydrate, for the sake, so for a concentrated period of time. So even an endurance athlete might have a use for, dieting, quote unquote, during a selected period of times. But the mistake that athletes make all the time is trying to do them both simultaneously. And so when I encounter one of those athletes, it's like, I want to get fitter than I've ever been, and I want to lose a whole bunch of weight. I'm like, no. Like you got to do them sequentially. You can't co-prioritize those two things. Pick one.
Exactly. And so the athlete is trying to meet or exceed the demands of endurance events or races. And you have to do that in a way that combines smart nutrition, daily nutrition, but also fueling, so that you can be able to train effectively, right? So if you try to diet excessively, you're not going to be able to have the energy to really train well. That's what I find. Many athletes make that mistake.
They do.
Okay, so let's finish up. You've been very generous with your time, and let's finish up and talk about, as a coach, and given all of the heightened awareness around this topic over the years, and mostly a lot of the conversation in the public sphere being dominated by how people or athletes will abuse some of these strategies. How have you changed, if you have made any changes to the way that you coached this with athletes? And I'm finding now, if I'm coaching an athlete, I'm now trying to figure out how do I, if I try to change how I coach this, right? So many coaches will take an initial assessment of data. Now, do you continue to do that throughout the training cycle, or do you try to gauge this with the athlete? Because maybe some athletes are not comfortable with it. So how have you changed, if you've changed at all, and what are some of the things that you might recommend to coaches?
It's mostly what has changed is the environment, as I alluded to earlier, and I have changed with it because, as a coach, to operate effectively, you have to understand the environment, that your athletes are living
right
in. So it's not so much my core beliefs that have changed as just, I'm a pragmatist, as any good coach is. So I'm just trying to help athletes achieve their goals. And so, with a pragmatist, you have to sort of, read which way the wind is blowing sometimes, just to properly contextualize the guidance you give athletes. So, to answer your question more directly, one thing that may be a little bit different now is that I wait for athletes to bring up the topic of body weight or body composition. If they never bring it up, I never do. And so, like, if it's on their mind, if there's an athlete who says, what, I think, if I lost a little weight, I could run better, or, do better in triathlon, then I will, take the next step and start to see, first of all, where that's coming from. Just because they have the goal doesn't mean they necessarily have the goal for the right reasons, or the right motivations. Is it coming from a healthy place or not? If I sense that it is, then I will just, start doing things by the book, taking some steps to move them in that direction. Right. Interestingly, coincidentally, just yesterday, I had a conversation. It was just a one-off consultation with an athlete, not someone I coach, but just, like a 1 hour thing. And this athlete had a history of disordered eating. And she was telling me, I asked her, what are your goals for this coming year? And, one of them was to, run a certain time for a half marathon. Another one of them was to get down to, a certain body fat percentage. And I actually discouraged her from, I said, what, I don't think that's actually a good goal for you. I think you should focus on, I like your goal for running a certain time for the half marathon and other, sort of, performance relevant outcome goals. But, given your history and your vulnerability in that regard, I recommend you leave that one alone. Yeah. Focus on the process. So I've done that. I do that routinely now, actually, with athletes.
Yeah. I'm a pragmatist too, and I'm very data centric as well, and scientifically centered. So, and there are some people that say a coach should never employ these approaches inside of the training cycle. But I've been thinking about it more, right? Because, I mean, if you take yourself out of the coach athlete environment, right? So let's say, you're looking for help with your finances and you hire a financial advisor. You would never tell the financial advisor, I can't give you my tax statements, or I can't give you my credit card statements or things like that, or I don't want to give that to you. The financial advisor would look at you and go, well, that would be helpful in me helping you. And so that's what I think about. I mean, am I not giving that athlete everything that I could give them by taking data, evaluating it, giving recommendations and such? And so that's the balancing act now. I mean, I think I agree with you that I think if you come across someone that is open about having a history of eating disorders or disordered eating, I think it's probably right that you just completely push back from any, certainly any aggressive strategies or goals in that area. You've been very generous with your time. What are some other thoughts that you have here around this topic? Do you have any final things that you would recommend to athletes that might help them? Maybe something since the book has been written that you would want to leave to athletes of all abilities, from recreational to professional, when considering the racing weight question?
One thing that didn't come up in the course of our conversation was, my observation in studying the diets and eating habits of elite endurance athletes all over the world, in various disciplines, triathlon, running, cross-country skiing, cycling, you name it, is that what the most consistent pattern actually is that these athletes enjoy eating. Like, they actually like their diet, and it's not a lot of work for them. They don't have a lot of stress around the way they eat. They don't have like this, kind of recurring guilt cycle. And that's really sort of a good news story. I mentioned earlier, it's not just about looking at science, it's looking at real world best practices. It's like, what are the folks who I aspire to be more like doing? And what they're doing is not fad diets, and it's doable, it's sustainable. Like, they eat like normal people, just with, just a relatively high standard for quality. A lot of them are into cooking, they're foodies. They're not depriving themselves. The stuff they eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner tastes good. They don't go hungry. They don't, they're not starving themselves. So, sometimes I'm tempted to tell athletes, like, my prescription for you is to spend 80% less time thinking about food.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so you wrote one of the other books, The Endurance Diet, which is another book of yours that I own. That book also has a number of examples of eating habits from those people. And what you universally find is that, like you said, there's so much good food, healthy food, whole food. And if you're eating that stuff as part of your daily nutrition strategy, I mean, you almost can't go wrong. So when you look at some of the most accomplished athletes on the planet, they're eating a lot of high quality food. The Endurance Diet, another one of your books. That's a good one. Okay. So how can people find you out on social media?
I am, Twitter is at Matt Fitwriter. Instagram is Fitzgerald.Matt. My personal website, mattfitzgerald.org. And then my business website, 8020endurance.com. That's the whole training side. When I come back on your show, we can talk about the 80-20 thing.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that. Let's set it up. And run like a pro. Pick it up. Matt Fitzgerald and Ben Rosario. All right. So, Matt, thanks again for coming on to the podcast.
Appreciate it, Tony.
Thanks again to Matt Fitzgerald for being a great podcast guest. I will absolutely get him back on the podcast again, maybe this year, to talk about the 80-20 training approach that he popularized. And I ask that you go to the show notes and pick up the book Racing Weight: How to Get Lean for Peak Performances, the 6-step plan for endurance athletes. I'll also put the link to the racing weight calculator that Matt referred to, and caveat, it's an estimate calculator that is more directional than anything to help someone come up with a realistic estimation. As always, when you're conversating with someone and you're getting into it, the time just melts away. And so there's much more science that we didn't even get to. And you can find a lot of it with respect to this topic in the book. You may also take a look at his new book, Run Like a Pro, Even If You're Slow. And he's got many books out there. So between us, myself and Matt, we've coached thousands of athletes, male, female, younger, and older. And that's individual coaching and through training programs, training program construction, nutrition programs. We're both nutritionists and both have a long career as endurance athletes ourselves. So, having that credibility, I hope we were able to convince you that this topic of body composition for racing performance, this is just one tool in an entire toolbox that you have available to you and that coaches have available to you. So to just simply focus on this one alone, that's a sort of lazy way out, right? So look at the full gamut of training, nutrition, fueling, everything, athlete psychology, race execution strategy, pacing. All of it plays a role in your performance. You don't want to get consumed with simply hitting some number on the scale. And finally, maybe you are an athlete that is training for very high performance and you may be looking for someone to do a little bit more with you on a competition, optimal body composition. Then don't be afraid to seek out qualified and experienced people to help you put together a science and evidence-based approach that'll help you avoid some of the pitfalls. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you have any comments about this podcast, you can send your message to contact@eventhorizon.tv. Have a good day and stay safe.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.